All right, here we go. Section 106 is basically a law that established that any federal agency having a direct or indirect jurisdiction over a proposed federal or federally assisted project undertaking, they must take into account historic preservation, um, and also give various interested members of the public and the other like the advisory council opportunity to comment as well. Term historic property is for any prehistoric or historic district, site, building, structure, or object included in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register, including the artifacts, records, materials, remains related to the district, site, building, structure, or object. It's laid out in that law down there. An undertaking basically is any action carried out on behalf of the federal agency using federal assistance, requiring a federal permit, license, or approval, and those pursuant to regulate local regulations administered pursuant to the delegation or approval by a federal agency. So what number 4 means is basically like the Federal Highway Administration allows the state level departments of transportation to handle the Section 106 process in their stead. Since the state is more obviously on our level, we work with DOH a lot on projects like that. This is a statutory obligation for a federal agency to fulfill the requirements of Section 106. Now they can hire consultants to do that for them. Most of the time, that's what they do. And the agency or the people who are the group, whoever's obtaining the government money or permits, are the ones that are usually completing the 106 process with us. If there are more than one federal agency involved, they will designate one as a lead federal agency who make the ultimate calls about the 106 process. Consulting parties, including us as the State Historic Preservation Office, as well as other tribal historic preservation office, if they're involved. We have a 30-day window to respond to Section 106 review requests. The federal agency may use the services of applicants, consultants, or designees to prepare information, analysis, and recommendations, but the agency is the one who remains legally responsible for the required findings and determinations. So basically, that means that if the federal agency hires a lousy consultant, the federal agency is still on the hook for making sure the 106 is completed properly. There are 4 processes in the 106 process. The first one is to initiate the review process. Step 2 is identification of historic properties. Step 3 is assessment of effects. And step 4 is a resolution of adverse effects. I think we go into each step next here. All right, for step 1, is it an undertaking? Basically, undertakings are federally permitted or funded projects that will take place, and if you answer yes to both of them, that it will be an undertaking and it will potentially affect historic resources, then the consulting parties need to be identified. Public may or may not, depending on what the nature of the project is, and then they initiate consultation with our office. So this basically the agency will provide us a description, or their representatives, however they're working with it, will provide us a scope of their work, and which will establish the various areas of potential effect, so that we can review the project and know how to. Okay, the consulting parties obviously are us as the State Historic Preservation Office. Any of the tribal preservation offices are involved. Local governments, including the CLGs, the HLCs are also involved. The applicant themselves are a consulting party, as well as the property owners, any interested persons, and concerned organizations such as historical societies, or if there's a battlefield involved or something, the battlefield folks might be interested. Those kind of groups. And we're at the identification of historic property. So we have an undertaking. They've initiated consultation with us, and now they're going to go out and identify properties or identify resources. And for that, they need to establish an area of potential effect, as shown on this one. It'd be the purple area. That's where the project is going to take place. So if it's like a development, they're going to develop that area. This could also be they want to put a small building somewhere out here. The USDA wants to fund a small barn. They're not 100% sure where, but they'll cover the whole property. So whenever the farmer makes up his mind, they can go and put it on wherever they need to on the parcel. It's the area of potential effects consider the geographic area or areas where the undertaking may directly or indirectly cause alterations to the historic character of the property. So that means we take into account view sheds and potential even like noise or vibration as well. If the highways wants to expand out and be closer to a foundation, we might have to take into consideration what the rumbling trucks will do to the building. Let's see if I can get to go to the next screen now. Maybe. There we go. Direct effect, obviously the ground disturbance. So that's where, or demolition of a building. Those would be direct effects. As you can see, the ground's being disturbed or the building itself is being torn down. Indirect effects are the more difficult to have a firm line on, because the view sheds can extend for miles. Sound might there might be a hill that'll block a sound of an airport for one side of the district, but maybe the other side will get the full dose of it. So it's the indirect effects are more negotiable and require some more survey and detail to firmly establish. I'll probably skip through 3 or 4 slides at a time. There you go. Oops. Now, so now once you identify the properties, you have to determine if they're eligible or included in the National Register. And then the federal agency, as the lead federal agency, is responsible for carrying out those appropriate identification efforts. So again, they might hire a cultural resource management firm or have another expert do it for them, but they are still responsible for it. These are 2 links to where our National Register lists are, and then our WebGIS. The WebGIS is very handy because it also shows boundaries. Historic districts and such have boundaries. So if, as Susan was talking about with the REIT projects, any folks with a REIT project, you want to use the West Virginia WebGIS. You can type in your address for whatever property is going to be impacted, and it'll come up and show if there's an HPI form, a historic property inventory form, already documenting the resource, or if it's within a historic district. So it'll give you an idea of what kind of situation might arise as your review progresses. It's also good for any property owners who are interested in maybe pursuing tax credits or such as well, because you can check to see if you're already listed or not. Historic properties can include anything from buildings like homes and barns, sites, battlefields, trails. So the Appalachian Trail is one that comes right to mind on that one, and remains of prehistoric villages. The remains of prehistoric villages will not be on our WebGIS site because archaeological sites are protected information. So if you are concerned about a potential archaeological site in a project area, you will need to contact our archaeologists and work with them directly, and they can help you out with that. We also have structures, which some of our bridges, dams, and canals, like the Wheeling Suspension Bridge is a listed resource. Objects, sculptures, monuments, fountains, and mile markers. The Mason-Dixon markers up through Ohio County where 70 runs, as well as we have I think that's the Hatfield statue out in cemetery, maybe Logan County, I do believe. There's also historic districts. These are the concentrations of like residential areas or commercial areas. They can also be rural villages or like farming areas can be a rural historic district as well. It can also cover like mining areas. Like some of our mining sites are extremely large with multiple years of activity, so they can be a district to encompass all those activities. what are the eligibility requirements for the National Register? There's the age, at least 50 years of age, for the majority of resources. For our reviews, we ask people to document resources that are 45 years of age or older, because our reviews are good for 5 years. So if someone has a Section 106 review, it was done 2 years ago, our findings are still good for the next 3 years after that. There are 4 criteria of evaluation, and then 7 special criteria considerations where it's possible for like a newer resource to be added, that's less than 50 years of age. And then we also take into account the aspects of integrity, which we'll go into here as well. And then assess the significance at either local, state, regional, or national level, because various resources can have a varying degree of significance. Criteria A is associations with events that made broad contribution to patterns of history. This is where a lot of historic neighborhoods are added. Railroad transportation. This would be a transportation related resource, so it's associated with transportation criteria A. Bridges as well. Sometimes are A because they're with travel, but they also fall in a later one we'll get to here in a minute. Criteria B is associated with the significant persons. It's more than just George Washington slept here. I know that's a fairly common one that people like to think of when it's associated with a famous person, but it's more of I'm not 100% that the Thurnberg house is off the top of my head, but I'm assuming it must be associated, like the Thurnberg family was an important family or something like that. But also, it could be like where research was conducted, like where I think George Washington Carver's research center place was for criteria B as well, because it's associated with his life. Criteria C is the other one where bridges fall in, because it's possesses distinctive characteristics of the type, period, or method of construction, representing the work of a master or possessing high artistic value. So that's like the wheeling suspension bridge would be a work of a master. So it's criteria C. Various if it's eligible as like a Tudor revival style, because it's a high artistic value of a specific style, that would be where criteria C it falls as well. And if you have a building or whatever and you're curious, we are glad to help out as well. Criteria D is real important information for either history or prehistoric resources. So that's like a Native American mound. Battlefields can fall under criteria D as well, because you can go out and decipher where the various battlements were placed, so you can like recreate the battle with the information potential. And theoretically, if there was like a uniquely constructed building, the construction method itself may be eligible under criteria D, but that's a pretty rare situation. Right. The first aspect of integrity is pretty obvious: location. That's wherever the resource was built. It's where it's at. If it's still there, it's got integrity of location. If it's been moved, it no longer has this integrity of location. Design, that's as close to original as possible. So you don't want your windows to be expanded or a new door cut into the side if possible. So you want to keep the design as close as possible as you can. Setting is the area around the area. So like a farmhouse on its original undeveloped farmstead has a lot more integrity of setting than a farmhouse that now has a suburb surrounding all 4 sides of it. So that would be an example of the setting being impacted. Materials pretty standard as well. If it's got its original clapboard siding, its original wood frame windows, it would have integrity of materials. Some material loss is to be expected, because that's siding's meant to be a little bit sacrificial, but we want to have it replaced in kind as much as possible when the situations arise when it needs replaced. Workmanship and materials are similar in my opinion. Also kind of with design and workmanship, it's a little hard to differentiate the differences, but this I get the you still you see the brickwork and whatnot. And the brickwork is it hasn't been altered. They haven't repointed it to the point where you can't see the brick anymore and that kind of stuff. Feeling is taking basically all the location, the setting, the workmanship, the materials, taking it all together and how it sits as an entire object or entire property and its setting and everything as its feel. And association. So like if it's say well, Harper's Ferry. So because it's still Harper's Ferry is Harper's Ferry, it maintains its association because it's been able to preserve the buildings and whatnot that bring you back to that era of our history. If there are no or historic properties are not located in the APE and we in our office concurs, that means the Section 106 process is finished. We sign a letter that says there'll be no effect, no historic properties will be affected, and the project moves forward. If historic properties are located in the project area in the APE, but there will be no effect or no adverse effect, and we concur, that also finishes the process. So like if a project wants to replace the wood siding with wood siding, replacement in kind, that'll generally be no adverse effect. So that clears it as well. If historic properties are located in the AP and will be adversely affected, and we concur, and our office concurs that it will be adversely affected, we move on to step 3. Yeah, this luckily we have been fairly lucky on our disagreements, but occasionally a federal agency and a SHPO will disagree, in which case the official determination comes from the Secretary of the Interior. This will happen on rare occasions where somebody doesn't want something to be eligible, but maybe we consider it to be eligible. So luckily, we are usually able to work out situations like that, but there is a role for the Secretary of the Interior to play if need be. Right, now on to assessment of effect. Okay, so we have a historically significant building or site or structure that's going to be affected. So an adverse effect is found when an undertaking may alter directly or indirectly any characteristics of a historic property that qualify it for inclusion in the National Register in a manner that would diminish its integrity of the property's location, design, settings, materials, workmanship, or feeling or association. So this would be something like maybe you're not going to hit the farmhouse itself, but you're going to build a development around it. So now you're cutting down on its setting and its feeling because it no longer feels like a farm. It's no longer sitting on a farm. So that could rise to an adverse effect. We also take into account the public, members of the public and interested organizations who also comment because their opinions are important to us at this step as well. Physical destruction or damage from an undertaking obviously is going to be an adverse effect. So if, for instance, you want to demolish a house that's a contributing resource to a historic district, we would really like you not to do that, but sometimes buildings get to the point of no return and it's becoming a public nuisance and someone might get hurt when it collapses or something like that. So it's going to there's no way to avoid or minimize it, which we'll talk about coming up here, I do believe, as well. Alterations to the property that do not conform to the Secretary of the Interior standards as well will be an adverse effect. So replacing, let's say, 4x4 wood frame windows with modern 1/1 insulated units. Well, it would be good for energy usage. It's not following the Secretary of the Standards requirements that recommend that replacement in kind. You want to replace things out as close to possible as you can if they're not restorable. They want you to restore first. If restoring is not practical, then replacement in kind. Oops, bouncing things here. Removal of the property, obviously, if you're going to move something, it could be adverse effect. Changes in the historic purpose or use can be an adverse effect. We're kind of a little less concerned about that with adaptive reuse because we would rather a building be used for something than just left to rot on its own. Property set and changing the setting again. That's where, like, if you want to chop down the original orchard that contributed to farmstead, that could change its setting, so that could also rise to an adverse effect. Introducing visual, atmospheric, or audible noise elements. So putting a giant cell phone tower in the middle of the downtown historic district would be frowned upon. Neglecting of a property can result in demolition by neglect, which can count as an adverse effect as well. Oops. And then transfer or lease out of a federal ownership without adequate restrictions on the deed to ensure the continued preservation of a property. Every now and then, the GSA will liquidate one of their buildings, and someone will buy it up. And if it's an eligible building, the GSA is really good at putting a covenant on the deed to make sure that the building is preserved in perpetuity. So if anybody acquires a building from a federal agency like that, make sure you double check your deed to make sure you agree to any stipulations that come with it. All right, now we're into resolutions of adverse effects. So we've determined that you're going to have to tear down an eligible building. You want to put a subdivision on an eligible farmstead. There's no way to avoid it. There's no way to minimize it. Well, that's the first thing we want to do. We're going to request that you avoid, minimize, or mitigate the adverse effects. So avoidance, maybe not tearing down the house, maybe so figuring out an alternative use for it, maybe get a coffee shop in it, or maybe a brewery or something like that, would avoid the adverse effect. Minimizing the adverse effect might be, okay, so you're going to have to take some of the farmland of the old farmstead, but you want to leave the 20 acres closest to the house as rural farmland for small farming operation or whatever, while you develop the rest of the parcel. So that would minimize the adverse effect. And mitigation would be, well, we can't avoid it or minimize it, and it's a public nuisance or whatever. It's dangerous. The fire burned out half of it. It's about ready to fall down. Then we go to mitigation, where we develop mitigation strategies to remediate it. And then when we get to that point, we develop an agreement called a memorandum of agreement, an MOA. Basically, that stipulates what mitigation measures will be used, either to minimize or to mitigate the adverse effects of resulting from the project. It's basically a way to complete the Section 106 process while mitigating the unavoidable adverse effects that will result from a project plan. And at this point, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, will be invited to participate as well, because they are required by law to be notified of an adverse effect, and they are given 15 days to decide if they want to participate or not. Knock on wood, they generally are acceptable as long as both parties are agreeable. They generally don't get involved, but they're also helpful if there is a disagreement. They can be a step in between having to go all the way up to the Secretary of the Interior to address differences in opinions. All right, and that's basically the summary of the 106 process. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to. I mean, I don't know if anybody's been typing on the text thingy or not. But.
Thanks, Ben. Any questions about Section 106? You all would basically be participating in the sense of, giving opinions after our office has reviewed them and things of that nature. So.
Yeah, we request that a lot of projects get sent out, especially PAWV as our voluntary nonprofit, to help with our opinions and to make sure that interested members of the public and concerned organizations know about it as well, so that we get as many thoughts as possible. Any CLGs that are in a project area we get requests. We cannot force anybody to notify you, but we request that they do.